today's media, Asian culture is everywhere, but Asian people are still largely misunderstood. We see Asian inspired aesthetics used as shorthand for mystery, sensuality, or danger. Traditional garments like the aoyai are repeatedly styled in hypersexualized ways, stripped of cultural context, and turned into costumes. In films and television, Asian women are still portrayed as exotic, submissive, or sexually available, while Asian men are often sidelined, infantilized, or erased altogether. Even when representation exists, it's often distorted. Yellowface, or the practice of non Asian actors portraying Asian characters, hasn't disappeared, it's simply evolved. From exaggerated accents to flattened pan Asian identities, Asian cultures are frequently collapsed into a single aesthetic, treated as interchangeable or ornamental rather than lived experiences. Movies like Miss Saigon continue to be revived despite heavy criticism, while Hollywood repeatedly centers Asian roles around white protagonists or saviors. At the same time, Asian cultural elements, which includes clothing, language, martial arts, and spirituality, are embraced, but Asian people themselves remain marginalized. This contradiction raises an important question. Why is Asian culture so desirable while Asian bodies are still dehumanized? To answer that, we have to look backward. To understand the sexualization of Asian American women, we need to begin with one of the earliest U.S. immigration laws, the Page Act of 1875. On paper, the Page Act was the first federal law to restrict immigration based on morality. It claimed to prevent the entry of women brought to the U.S. for quote unquote immoral purposes, such as prostitution. In practice, it overwhelmingly targeted Chinese women, operating on the assumption that Asian women were inherently sexually deviant. Immigration officials were given broad power to interrogate, detain, and deny entry to Asian women based on suspicion alone, and as a result, nearly all Chinese women were barred from entering the United States, not because of evidence, but because of racialized sexual stereotypes embedded in law. This marked a turning point where Asian women's bodies became legally regulated through sexuality. Furthermore, the Page Act didn't just restrict immigration, it shaped how Asian women were viewed in American society for generations. By codifying the idea that Asian women were prostitutes or morally corrupt, the US government legitimized a racial myth that Asian women were sexually available, dangerous, and unfit for respectable womanhood. These ideas spread beyond immigration offices and into mainstream culture. In early Hollywood films like Daughter of a Dragon, Asian women were portrayed as seductive, dangerous, and morally ambiguous. The character is hypersexualized and exoticized, positioned as both alluring and threatening. Overall, an embodiment of Western fears and fantasies about Asian femininity. These portrayals reinforce the idea that Asian women existed primarily as sexual objects or narrative tools rather than full characters. Decades later, these same stereotypes reappeared in Miss Saigon, a production that continues to be staged today. In the play, the Asian female protagonist is defined almost entirely by her sexual relationship with a white American soldier. She is portrayed as self sacrificing, submissive, and disposable, ultimately giving up her life so that her child can be raised in America. This storyline echoes the same logic introduced by the Page Act, where Asian women are only valuable through their sexuality, and even then, they are never meant to stay. Across time periods, genres, and mediums, the message remains consistent. Asian women are exotic, sexually available, and ultimately expendable. However, this system of sexualization didn't operate in isolation. As Asian American women were hypersexualized and cast as submissive objects of desire, Asian men were also simultaneously stripped of masculinity, portrayed as weak, asexual, and unworthy of intimacy. These two narratives worked together, reinforcing a racial hierarchy that centered white masculinity while controlling Asian bodies. To understand this system, we now need to examine how US law and media feminized Asian American men alongside sexualizing Asian American women. To understand how Asian American men were feminized, we begin with discussing the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This law was the first in US history to ban immigration based on race and nationality. While framed as a labor regulation, the act targeted Chinese men almost exclusively, casting them as economic threats, cultural outsiders, and fundamentally unassimilable. But beyond exclusion, the law had a gendered impact. By barring Chinese laborers from entering or re entering the country, and by severely restricting family reunification, the act created Chinese communities composed almost entirely of men. In American society at the time, masculinity was largely defined through citizenship and a patriarchal family hierarchy. By denying Asian men access to these institutions, the state effectively marked them as incomplete men and emasculated them from the rest of society. 10 years later, the Gary Act of 1892 intensified this gender exclusion. It required all Chinese residents to carry registration certificates at all times, and failure to do so meant arrest, forced labor, or deportation. Chinese men were denied legal protections afforded to other groups, including the right to bail or fair testimony in court. Essentially, this law transformed Asian men into perpetual suspects, constantly surveilled and criminalized. Their bodies were treated as inherently illegal, subject to state control and punishment. Crucially, this constant policing reinforced the idea that Asian men lacked autonomy and authority. They were positioned as dependent, powerless, and subordinates, traits culturally coded as feminine in the white American gender hierarchies. Political cartoons and newspaper illustrations around this time mocked Asian men as effeminate, submissive, and domestic, often depicting them in women's clothing or exaggerated feminine poses. These images weren't just jokes, they were state sanctioned propaganda used to justify exclusion and racial hierarchy. Through law and labor control, Asian men were systemically stripped of economic power as well as masculine legitimacy. Hollywood depicted Asian men in media as either servants or villains, comic relief, or even emotionless side characters. Even when Asian male characters appeared, they were often played by white actors in yellowface, reinforcing the idea that Asian men were unfit to represent themselves. These portrayals shaped modern stereotypes. Asian men became associated with being these socially awkward and asexual beings. And not only did this reflect society's views of Asian men, it helped create them, carrying forward a legacy of emasculation rooted in law, fear, and racial hierarchy. That said, these depictions of Asian American people still continue to plague society today, resulting in major anti Asian violence. The consequences of these stereotypes became impossible to ignore in 2021 during the Atlanta spa shootings, where 8 people were killed and 6 of them being Asian women. After his arrest, the shooter told police that he was trying to eliminate what he described as temptation. That word in of itself is not neutral, nor was it coming from a vacuum. It reflected a long history of viewing Asian women as inherently sexual and responsible for male desire. Asian women are cast as objects of desire rather than people, while violence against them is explained away as personal weakness instead of racialized misogyny. The Atlanta shootings were not an isolated incident. They were the result of a system that sexualizes Asian women and treats Asian bodies as disposable. When stereotypes are normalized in law, media, and culture, they don't stay on the screen. They show up in real life with devastating consequences. To fully understand the experiences of Asian Americans, we have to think intersectionally, recognizing how race, gender, sexuality, and power operate together, not separately. Asian women and Asian men were never oppressed in the same way. Asian women were hypersexualized, cast as exotic, submissive, and disposable, while Asian men were feminized, desexualized, and denied masculinity. These stereotypes didn't contradict each other, they reinforced one another within the same system. Law, media, and culture worked together to control Asian bodies differently, but intentionally. Immigration policies regulated who could enter the country, who could form families, and who could be seen as morally legitimate. Media narratives then normalized these ideas, turning structural violence into entertainment. Intersectionality helps us see that these experiences were not accidental nor individual. They were produced by overlapping systems of racism and sexism that create unique forms of oppression for Asian women and Asian men. By recognizing these intersecting forces, we can move beyond stereotypes towards a more honest understanding of Asian American history, one that acknowledges harm, resists erasure, and opens space for dignity and justice.